I'm Susie Hills and I'm the co-founder and joint CEO of Halpin Partnership and now a Senior Director of Huron. Halpin proudly joined Huron in March and is part of a global team providing transformational support to higher education institutions. Our team has a wealth of higher ed experience and many of us have had senior roles in the UK and in North America in universities. Together, we've worked with many thousands of higher education institutions globally, and whatever issues you're facing as senior leaders, we can provide you with expert support. We're really pleased you're joining us today for what promises to be a fascinating webinar. This is part of a series of webinars we're holding to explore key issues facing higher ed in the UK and globally. In the audience today, we have senior leaders from UK institutions, directors of strategy and transformation, chief operating officers and chief HR officers, and we look forward to insightful discussions and questions. Please use the Q&A function throughout to post your questions and we'll pick those up at the end. This webinar is being recorded so you can watch it again or share it with colleagues. With many universities facing intensifying financial pressures and seeking financial savings, efficiency and more effective organisational structures, today's discussion is timely. Our panel will explore some of the ways forward and answer your questions. I'm really grateful that some of the team are joining from the US. It's very early in the morning for them, so I know they've had super strong cups of coffee to get them started. And we've also got the very marvellous Paula Sanderson joining us from the UK. So I'm going to introduce the panel to you. Firstly, I'm going to introduce Paula. Paula is the Chief Operating Officer and Secretary at the University of Cardiff. She's held Chief Operating Officer roles at Middlesex, Queen Mary, University of London, SOAS, and the University of Reading in Malaysia, and senior operations roles at the Universities of Sydney and Exeter. She's led complex and challenging transformation change programs, and she's passionate about inclusion and creating psychologically safe cultures to develop high-performing teams. She's got a background in internal performance and audit, and she champions data-led strategy. Her doctoral research considered cultural complexity, governance, and ethical decision-making, all really important skills in these complex times. And she holds a Master in Tertiary Education Management from the University of Melbourne and a sustainability-based MBA. And Paula even then manages to fit in an executive program at Harvard Kennedy School, and she's a convener and member of the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Power Network. Secondly, we have Lee Smith. Lee leads our global Huron team providing consulting to higher education and research organisations. The team provides strategic consulting services across most higher education, academic and administrative functions. Lee's expertise in operating model assessment, design, governance, academic medical centre strategy and operations, and change management and compensation and classification. Prior to joining Huron 7 years ago, Lee served in various administrative leadership roles at 3 universities with attached medical centres, including the role of Chief Operating Officer. Thirdly, we have Jennifer Ramey. Jennifer has over 25 years of experience of higher ed as an executive leader and as a consultant. She uses her extensive experience to focus on operational improvements to enhance and maximise effective use of funds and institutional resources. She focuses her work on institutional resilience with the idea that higher education is built on intersections, and in order to achieve long-term sustainable growth, you can't cut, grow or spend your way out. Finally, Susan Basso. Susan co-leads the organisation and talent strategy area, which focuses on HR effectiveness, total rewards, workforce and talent strategy, operating model and service delivery. Prior to joining Huron, Susan spent 30 years in higher ed at 4 institutions as their chief HR officer, most recently at The Ohio State University, where she served as the chief human resources officer across the university and the academic medical centre. Prior to Ohio State, she was chief HR officer at Penn State, so 2 very large, complex, research-intensive institutions. So you're in very capable hands as we explore this issue. and the panel will share some introductory observations, and then we'll open up for questions. So first of all, I'll hand over to Paula.
Thanks, Susie, and it's good to be talking to colleagues. So I've done a little bit on the UK sector, cognizant that we have colleagues from the UK and US here. I think we're largely UK based, so I'm going to move through some of this relatively quickly. But just to reiterate Susie's opening really around a time, I feel like I've been saying probably for a couple of years, it's an unprecedented time for the sector and it's the period of greatest pressure that we've experienced. And yet each year, I think that statement becomes ever more true. Real financial pressures, colleagues will know the effective value of the UK domestic tuition fee, if you adjust for inflation, has been deteriorating since 2012. So a 25 to 30% erosion in real terms of the funding for domestic students. And that's probably at the heart of the financial pressures that we have faced. Total higher education student numbers have actually fallen for the first time. So in 23-24, we've seen the sector fall by about 3%, but actually first degree falls of around 1%, whereas masters taught falling by about 8%. And that's really important because that's the deregulated part of the market. So we have had an over-reliance on international students, and we've really turned to international and that deregulated part of the market to help us to fill that gap in tuition fees. One area of the UK sector I think that is growing substantially is transnational education. So we're seeing very significant increases in transnational education. I'm foregrounding these things, I think, importantly to say, because I think they really do determine our response to the organisational structures that we're putting in place. So a retraction in the UK, growth, a fall in dependence on the international sector, but growth in mechanisms like transnational education, and actually digital transformation starting to point to new ways of students engaging with us and new means of learning. At the same time, students are expecting different services from us. So we know that post-COVID engagement and the way that we teach pedagogy is adapting, but also, some really significant concerns, and I'm sure these are global, around student health and well-being. So changing student expectations, but a sharp rise in the complexity and support needed by students, such that integrated student support models become more and more important in our organisational structures. So we're seeing cost of living pressures, post-COVID disrupted schooling. We're seeing greater incidences of social isolation and loneliness. We're seeing quite a lot of increased demand for disability and neurodiversity support. And actually, in our international student community, probably even more complex presentations of student need. As if that wasn't enough, our research funding is also under pressure. Universities, of course, lose money on most of the research they conduct. And with research cross-subsidising students, that puts us under greater pressure. We've seen a loss in EU research funding post-Brexit, and the charity and industry funding sector is becoming much more volatile for research funding. I won't labour on a lot of these, but regulatory pressures are increasing, and those colleagues that deal with the OFS, I say quite fortunately, I deal with MEDA rather than the OFS as part of the Welsh sector, but increased regulation and a sense that particularly, I think, post the Gillies report, increased regulation, but also increased scrutiny, oversight, involvement of our councils or our courts. And I think that creates a very different environment in which for change to happen and to lead. If we could move to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So really, I position this, and I'm not talking to all of those areas, but really to say that I think context is really critical as we look at organisational change. And no one change initiative that I've led has been the same. It's very difficult to, I think, textbook organisational change. Context is everything, and understanding future trends in the sector is absolutely critical to the way in which we shape our organisational structures. And I think, I'm sure colleagues are going to talk to this as we move forward, but that really does include the culture of the organisation in which you are working, and hence no situation being the same. But the UK is a sector under significant pressure. UCU published analysis showing UK universities had announced cuts of equivalent to 15,000 jobs. The TAB recently reported 37 universities had spent over £1 million on restructuring in 24-25, and yet we see greater pressure. You can't cut your way. I think Susie's opening line, you can't cut and you can't grow your way out. You need to redesign your services. So what do we need to do in order to meet that context? I think critically we need to change the way we engage with students, and we need to make sure that the change that we lead is academically led. So change that is focused on our academic body, but also on our student body. I think the type of change that we're now facing, so we've done, I think as a sector, we've done lots and lots of efficiency and effectiveness. There is always more we can do. But certainly many colleagues will have seen transformations of professional services, and those need to change. I'm leading another transformation of a professional services area here at the moment. But actually a lot of the change we've got to make looks at the academic space. So some of the hardest to touch areas, things like workload allocation, portfolio, course offers, a more direct response to market demand and to market retraction. And some of those things are incredibly hard as we respond within our academic community. I think the changes that we're looking at are around how we engage students in the classroom, around digital transformation, so less use of the estate and much more use of technology. And all of that points to new ways of working for both our academic and our professional service colleagues. So moving past efficiency and effectiveness into a space of transformation that is much more around culture, much more around customer service, and much more around support. So next slide, please. And I guess I thought it was really important to call out some of the bits that I hear as I talk to colleagues who are trying to help with transformation. So some of this is, I think that the sector, certainly in the UK, has been slow to respond and is a fairly traditional environment. So when I first stepped across from local government into higher education, my sense that we were moving into a forward-thinking and dynamic space, I'm not sure has necessarily been held in terms of our response to things like good process environments. So lots of the change that we're putting in place at the moment is really to respond to disparate and ineffective process environments. I'm not sure we have kept pace with systems infrastructure and systems progress. I would say that probably reflects in our core systems, things like our student information systems, where there are only a couple of viable products on the market. I think there's a new need to think about the balance I've put here between regulation and compliance and services to student and staff. I think here I really mean the balance between back office and front office. And I think we have tended to move to have our focus on back office and on compliance for very good reasons. But the need and the pull from students and staff is to a much more interactive idea of individual student journeys, meeting the needs of students, meeting the needs of academic colleagues. And, you know, I think we're in an era where I've put protectionism, and I think that's probably going to be a little evocative for some people responding, but that traditionalism in our services really is deep-rooted. And at the nub of really positive change is the way we engage and we take people with us on the journey. And that's difficult when we're in reactive and responsive mode. So I know that I'm really looking forward to colleagues talking about how you can prepare for change. I think lots of us have had to move into change without preparation. I always like to have a framework in the background. I'm not fixed on frameworks, but I think it's really helpful. My go-to tends to be the McKinsey 7S framework, which I think is not perfect, but I think it's really important that we think about both the hard and the soft elements of change. I think in the sector, we're really good on the hard elements. What's our strategy? What are the structures that we're looking at? But I think we've probably spent less time addressing behaviours and my own personal passion, less time really developing and giving our staff the skills that they need for transformation. So I'm going to rest there if that's okay, probably posing more questions and answers, but hand over to colleagues.
That's great. And over to Lee. Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paula. What a terrific introduction. And thank you so much for having me here today, Susie. I wanted to provide just a quick overview of what we're seeing as market pressures on higher education in the US. There's going to be quite a bit of overlap with what Paula just covered, but some distinctive elements as well. We could spend probably an hour talking about each of the 12 points that I've listed here, but I want to just run through them very quickly as an intro. So the first piece is that the competition for undergraduates is really intensifying in the US. There are a number of factors, including demographic, including student choice, that is creating a smaller pipeline of undergraduates overall that are looking to attend baccalaureate programs. So the competition has increased. Among those undergraduates, though, we're seeing a relative shift from focusing on ROI and a lot of the prominent brand names that are connected to that and being much more price sensitive. On the international front, we've seen a lot of pressures there, and certainly related to visa approvals and so forth. A lot of US institutions have seen 20 to 40% decreases in their international student population this year. Alongside this, the federal government in the US has really changed its approach to financial aid. Some grant programs have changed materially. Also, in particular, at the graduate level, some of the loans that are available to students are changing quite a bit. Student demand and faculty talent have really become misaligned, and we see that programs that institutions invested in a couple of decades ago still have tenured faculty in place, even though those programs might not be of highest interest to some students right now. Some institutions have responded to this by really focusing more on part-time faculty hires or on non-tenure track faculty hires. Research funding is a particular pressure point. Paula really highlighted some similar challenges in the UK there, but both in the quantity of grants that are being awarded and the funds associated with them, as well as the indirect cost support for those. We've seen challenges on both ends. Shifting over to graduate education, this appears to continue to be quite the growth market in the US. Over the past 5 decades, the number of graduate students has increased every single decade. We see that trend continuing. Within doctoral education, we're also seeing a lot more doctoral programs emerge that are tied directly to specific industries and a real shift from some of the more traditional liberal arts and other doctoral programs into ones that reflect more of a partnership. The balance of power in higher education is continuing to change in the US as well. The Department of Education being unwound is really the primary example of shift there. But also as we look at accreditation structures, we look at state higher ed structures, there's a lot of power shifting that's going on, and often that is connected with some political elements as well. For some of our most wealthy institutions as well, we're beginning to see increased taxes applied to their endowments. It impacts a relatively small number of institutions, but it is a notable shift and could potentially impact more with policy changes in the future. Amidst all of this, we are seeing hundreds of institutions that face a true risk of closure. This is pushing many of them to look at merger and acquisition opportunities really to sustain themselves. And then finally, institutions are looking to diversify revenue, particularly those institutions that have been tuition based in the past. How can they identify new revenue streams? Some of this can come through philanthropy, some of this comes through corporate and other local partnerships, et cetera. So you take all of these 12 elements together, and you create a situation where American higher ed institutions are beginning to ask a lot of questions internally, particularly related to how the institution is functioning financially and how the institution thinks about getting its work done and obtaining and retaining the talent that they need. So from here, we'd love to pivot it over to both Jennifer and Susan to talk a little bit about, in this context, how institutions are thinking about ways in which they need to be resilient. And then as we shift over to Susan, how they're thinking differently about their operating models and talent management as well. So why don't I hand it over to Jennifer to talk a little bit about institutional resilience?
Thanks, Lee. So we do think about performance and health in higher education through our philosophy, as Lee said, of institutional resilience. And I think what's interesting is, to us, true resilience isn't driven by any single change. It isn't driven by a rapid crisis response that just puts a plaster over the problem. Resilience is only achieved by developing and implementing a balanced portfolio of opportunities that are really sequenced and they're aligned with your multi-year budget planning. And so, like you certainly, Lee just shared, we've been experiencing these unprecedented challenges. And so when that happens, very often the first area that people think about is, where should I be cutting? And I'd say, while that's part of it, and those are very, very hard decisions that have to be made, it doesn't just mean where you're cutting. It also means, where do you have to grow? Where do you have to invest in order to grow or stabilize? Where do you need to reallocate resources? And so this requires really hard conversations about trade-offs, about mission, about strategic objectives. But having those hard conversations, but not just the conversation, right? But then acting on the outcomes is really the only way to actually set that path to short and long-term sustainability. So when we think about institutional resilience, we ground that work around these 8 areas that you're seeing here. I won't do a deep dive into all of them, but each of them is an essential element in financial and strategic resilience. We'll look at a couple of them here. But we look broadly at your institution. What does your marketing and retention look like? Are there areas of opportunity here, especially in light of the dependence on international students, as an example? Do you have the right strategy? Is there an opportunity for cost containment and looking at your labor, your non-labor spend? And once that's determined, do you have opportunities in your organizational structure and operating model, Susan's going to talk about in a minute, to not only save money, but deliver in a more effective and efficient and thoughtful way to serve your students ultimately? But more importantly, we really emphasize, I mentioned, those intersections between these areas. That's the real difference maker in these efforts. None of these areas exist in a vacuum. So you may save costs, for example, by cutting professional service expenses. But if you do that without thinking about the student life cycle, you might get an unpleasant surprise when student retention drops 2 years down the line because of a decision that you made prior to. To be honest, that's not just poor strategy. It also completely counteracts the financial goals that you're seeking in the first place and negates anything that you tried to do in all those tough decisions that you already had to make. So a big part of this is ensuring that any initiative takes an appropriately comprehensive view of the solution. So as an example, if you're thinking about reorganization, but you aren't thinking about technology, then what that really is, it's trying to solve a puzzle with 25% of the pieces missing. So there can be different priorities and emphasis across these areas, because we really believe there's no cookie cutter solution, right? Every institution has differences, nuances, things that you've tried, things that have worked, haven't worked, decisions you've made thus far. So we don't approach this as a cookie cutter solution. Everything really must be customized to where the institution is and where it wants to go. But it has to be grounded on the knowledge that resiliency in higher education comes from winning the marathon, not the sprint. And change management around this work is so important. So one thing I mentioned already, I'm going to go back to it within this work, is one of these key areas here within the 8 areas that are on the screen that really consistently comes to the forefront of when we do this work, no matter the approach, no matter the institution, really is that organizational optimization. So I'm going to turn it to Susan to expand on how you can further identify those opportunities that you might have in this important area.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So we've heard Jennifer talk a little bit here about institutional resilience framework and our 8 focus areas. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes, as Jennifer mentioned, going a little bit deeper into organizational optimization and specifically how we think about operating model, the workforce strategy, and how best to transition your workforce. A successful restructure, in our opinion, requires designing the new structure around the organization's needs and then ensuring you have the right people while also actively managing change to mitigate any risks that you might have to morale and productivity. Your people really need to feel connected and aligned to the work, so that the work is foundational, your culture won't erode, collaboration will be strong, and that the change will actually stick. So planning for the workforce impact early and upfront is critically important, since in our experience, real organizational transformation isn't technical, it's human. When we begin our operating model work, we holistically identify opportunities to optimize. We focus on understanding organizational mission, vision, and values, its culture, strategy, and leadership. And then the focus turns to structure, looking at roles, reporting, and decision-making. As Jennifer shared, and we heard a couple of times already today, we really challenge leaders to look beyond kind of the quick fixed cost cutting to think about how the work is actually done. So we look at the behavioral, structural, and enabling dimensions of the work. Behaviorally, we think about the why and the what. Why are staff motivated to do this work? And what is the ideal for behavior within this function? The structure is actually the how. So how do you structure the function to improve its work? And how do you distribute responsibilities to really drive vision? And then we focus on the enabling dimensions. So how do you enable the new structure through desired behaviors to optimize workforce, processes, finance, and technology? Oftentimes, organizations want to jump right to the enabling dimensions, and that's okay, but we find it is often not a sustainable approach. So our goal for an effective workforce strategy is really to ensure we can achieve legal compliance, transparent communication, and a dignified experience for all employees while still safeguarding institutional assets. We find that the most important focus areas for effective workforce activities include organizational design, communication and engagement, legal and compliance, and then, of course, employee support. We suggest redesigning roles and responsibilities to support future needs and provide leadership development for managers that are overseeing the change. We support coordinating a very comprehensive communication plan by developing clear and consistent messaging for stakeholders and providing FAQs, formal consultation meetings, and regular updates. It's really important to clearly define the why and explain the reasons for the restructure to employees so that they understand the benefits and how it addresses problems. At this point, we also find it's very important to avoid making promises you can't keep and be upfront with employees about the process and potential outcomes. We always recommend using multiple channels for communication and repeat information often to keep everyone informed and reduce ambiguity as much as possible. Really engaging key stakeholders will foster collaboration and really ensure that you can maintain trust. So getting that input from employees early and often to build that buy-in and a better understanding of the problems that you are hoping to solve. So implementing these people-focused strategies to prepare employees for role changes or redundancies, internal redeployment opportunities, and sometimes even job loss is extremely important. And then upskilling and supporting effective employees with transition resources, which, as I mentioned, can range from upskilling to emotional and well-being support. Always be aware of and comply with all applicable labor laws, especially regarding redundancy, notification, and consultation processes. It's really important also to have a risk mitigation plan and be in lockstep coordination with your legal counsel. And of course, handle potential job losses with empathy, ensuring employees have the support they need during a difficult transition. So, turning to workforce transition, a really important aspect of this is having a workforce transition framework. And we have one that provides a structured approach that aligns people, roles, and resources, supporting transparent decision-making, employee engagement, and continued advancement of the university mission. Find the right people for the roles and define the desired outcomes and the work needed, then design the structure and the roles. We look to evaluate current talent against future needs and identify where training and development are required for new or changed roles. Sometimes here you need to be prepared for what might be a drop in morale and engagement, and we suggest monitoring these issues through surveys and feedback and implement initiatives to really support employees. And of course, clearly outline how each employee's roles, responsibility, and reporting structure will change to help them prepare for new tools, skills, or even locations. And then, of course, ensure they have the capacity to focus on new tasks and improvements, not just day-to-day operations. Define what success looks like and then monitor the reorganization's effectiveness over time. And then finally, and we heard Jennifer talk a little bit about change management, that really needs to be a structured, systematic approach that enables you to really transition smoothly from the current state to the desired future state. If you really don't focus on managing the change, it could mean the difference between project success and costly failure. So with that, Susie, back over to you and hopefully some interactive Q&A at this point.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Susan. I'm going to stop sharing the slides so you can see us all, and I'd love to encourage all of you to start posting in the Q&A, put those questions in there. I've got some introductory sort of things that I would love to hear a bit more about, having heard from our panel. And one of those, I think maybe for Paula, what I'd love to hear, you've led restructures at various institutions. What are the sort of key lessons that you've taken from those experiences, if you feel willing to share those? You're on mute, Paula.
One of us had to do it, didn't we? I guess as I reflect that every one of those changes was very, very different. So although all within the sector, the actual process of change was very different. And that's, I guess, going back to my earlier points in that strategy and context are just everything. And I think particularly, whilst the external context is very similar for us, the internal context of every institution, I think it's hard to say that we're one sector at the moment, actually. I think the sector is so varied, that context is so important, and culture is absolutely critical. So my biggest reflection really is the hard stuff is actually the easy stuff. So what does your org design look like? How does that meet and deliver your needs? What does your service model look like? I'm not saying these things are easier, but actually that hard stuff is actually the easier of the change stuff. And the soft bits, those elements around, well-being and support for staff and movements in culture and helping people to understand what behaviours are important, are actually the much harder bit of the change. I guess we all know that, but just, that has been reiterated through every change that I've led. And then I was just listening to the piece on communications, and I guess one of my reflections on communications is people do not hear you until they know what it means for them. It doesn't matter how many times you communicate. I mean, I think in our current change, well, certainly over the last 4 weeks, and we're in the middle of a 2-stage consultation process, we've had 200 engagement events through different mediums, and people will still say to me, I'm not sure you've engaged enough. And so I think the point there, and we're on the org design bit rather than what does it mean for you bit. And I think people genuinely don't hear in that place of anxiety until they really deeply get what the impact is on them personally. So in comms, I think my learning is keep it really simple, keep it really high level, keep it with the bits people can engage in, and almost have your 4 or 5 connected lines that everybody understands in terms of what you're trying to deliver. Because if you make it too complex, people are not hearing, and they're not hearing even more.
Fantastic, thank you. I might draw in Susan as to follow up on that, this theme of communication, and what guidance would you add, Susan, in terms of effective communication during these programs? Hearing Paula say that they've communicated that much, but some people still don't feel it's enough. Have you got any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree with everything that Paula has shared. And we have the same experience. You can never communicate enough to employees. And I think using multiple channels of communication, really using things, as I said in my comments earlier, using FAQs, really designing websites around the transformational work so that employees have easy access to information, allowing two-way channels for feedback so that you can really engage with the stakeholders on what might be working well, what's not working well, using different forums, whether that's in person or online. Just to really engage as much as possible and as often as possible. And as Paula indicated, it really does never seem to be enough. But I really do think helping them understand the why and what you're really trying to address and how this transformational effort might actually make their lives better from an administrative perspective can be very effective.
Susie, if I might jump in here, I have a framework that I love to use to really address what both Paula and Susan were just discussing. And I tend to call it developing a case for action that you can communicate effectively to people. And when I think about that case of action, it's having leaders develop succinct answers to 4 different questions. The first question is, what is changing? So just a basic description. What are we doing? The second question is, why are we doing it? And both of them touched on this. What is the why? And the why for your executive leadership is likely going to sound a little different than the why for your frontline employees. So you need to modify that depending on the population. The third question is, what are the positive impacts of these changes going to be? So what are we going to get out of it? And then the fourth question, and I think this one is really, really important, is what are the risks of maintaining the status quo? So if we don't change at all, what are potentially the negative repercussions of that? So being able to provide across your leadership team consistent, succinct answers to those 4 questions. What's changing? Why is it changing? What are the positive impacts of those changes? And what are the costs or consequences of maintaining the status quo? If you can begin to provide answers to that, then my experience is the communication with change initiatives begins to go much more smoothly.
Can I jump back in? I love that.
Mm.
What I would do is add one other question to it, which is what is not changing? Because I think as early on as possible, indicating to people, so there's a natural anxiety when you talk about change. Being really clear with people who are not changing at this point can just de-escalate quite quickly. So, being able to say this team is not impacted at this time. And actually, I quite often draw a big circle and say all of this bit is staying the same, this bit's changing. So you can be really clear with people and manage their expectations and anxieties, really.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you, panel. Keep posting those questions. I've got a question about leadership teams. How can executive leadership teams be mobilized successfully? It strikes me that these teams are under more pressure than they've ever been under. And I wonder, perhaps, Jennifer, your thoughts on how you mobilize as a team.
Sure. Yeah. We've talked a lot about change management. Sounds like it's quite a theme in our conversation today. It really is key in executing, and it's never going to be one size fits all. We've talked a lot about this. It has to start with that transparency at the leadership level. And I like what Paula just said too. It's what isn't changing. What we find sometimes too is a leader might come out and say, okay, this is what's not changing, promise. And then they have to come back later and say, oh, that is changing, right? And now you've totally eroded trust in the process and what's happening there. So I think really being clear about those areas, and maybe those 5 areas that were prompted earlier and mentioned by Lee and Paula. And what that really means, though, when we think about transparency at the leadership level, it means engaging your executive leaders from the start. There's no single leader that will cover all of the possible change areas that we're talking about. So you really have to build the full team. Ensure everyone is confident in the plan. And there's a really key word here, accountable for executing it. And so that means that they have to be actively engaged in the work. They have to understand their very specific role in owning that change and being a champion for that change. So passive leadership can really lead to really lackluster or lacking results. Building a team of individuals who feel accountable for their part in the success, even it could be a small portion of that plan, right? Every small bit leads to the overall change, leads to the overall results. That's where you can get those effective results. So I think a big part of that, mentioned earlier, is that building trust in the path forward. So how do you do that, right? That means that the data that you're using for the opportunities, it's vetted by the leaders. It's stress tested. It's refined. It's polished. So you're not assailing the data at that point, right? And we don't get into a data dispute around trying to make decisions about how to move forward. Doesn't mean everybody's going to love it, but it means that the data is accurate, it's vetted, it can be agreed upon. It means pushing your leaders to take off their functional area hat and put on the institutional hat. And that can be hard, right? And really genuinely understand why difficult change in their area is critical to the overall mission. So the best change programs don't support leaders in getting through one specific change. It builds a leadership team that can handle any change and really builds that resilience that we're talking about as we move forward.
That's brilliant. Thank you. We've got a question from Karen in the audience who's saying universities are excellent at adding more work to do. How have people assessed which work to keep? So stop layering on more and what do we let go of? Paula's nodding, so perhaps she could start on this one.
And there'll be lots of answers to this, but this really does resonate for me. And I think actually some of this is because, we are kind of perfectionists at what we want to do, and incredibly hardworking and always seeing additional value that we can add to, to student lives and to our research. My simple answer is really good process engineering. So, looking deeply together at the environment, looking at which elements and steps of your processes add value. It's quite dry stuff, making sure you've got a proper service catalogue. What services are you delivering? Are they really needed? And then for each of those services, what's the leanest way of delivering? And I think, then being really clear about as you make that process clearer, shorter, tighter, what are the benefits of that? So of course, efficiency and effectiveness, but most of the time you're just relieving people of really dull stuff. So I think quite often the stuff we're adding is the really good stuff, and it's about freeing up the bureaucracy underneath. So yeah, brilliant question.
I love that, Paula. I might just jump in as well and add, uh, I've seen processes emerge at a lot of universities that when I start to ask questions about it, I'll say, okay, you have an approval process here. When is the last time you have not approved a request like this? And the answer is, oh, I don't ever remember us not approving one. And so then if you peel back the onion a little more, you begin to ask, well, why do we have this approval process in place? And what you learn is that, oh, 22 years ago, one person did something wrong. And so then we built up this bureaucratic process to prevent that one thing from ever happening again. Sometimes anomalies can just be anomalies and don't have to be solved with kind of over-engineered business processes. Our tendency in the moment when something goes wrong is to create some type of business process that prevents it from happening again. But sometimes there are much simpler solutions that can allow things to flow easier. It can be much more welcomed by your university community. And is there potentially a little bit of risk there? There is, but when you compare that to the hundreds of thousands of hours that you might be putting into a process, then that risk might be okay to accept. And again, you make everything easier, both for your administrative staff as well as the end users, whether those be faculty, students, or staff.
Yeah, I would add here as well. I really appreciate this question also, because as I mentioned earlier, it is really important to be focused on the work, more so even than the individual. And universities are often notorious about organizing work around an individual and their particular skills, not necessarily the actual work that needs to be performed. And so I know when we're doing a lot of our transformational work, we actually work with a proprietary tool that really assesses how individuals are actually spending their time. So, how much time are they spending? What is it costing the institution to deliver that service? And we often find that a lot of that transactional work, while it very much defines the individual, it's really not value added. So, really understanding what individuals are actually doing on a day-to-day basis can really help the institution figure out if it's work worth continuing to do, or if it's work that can be done in a different way, or not at all.
Great, thanks, Susan. We're going to squeeze in two final questions that we've got from our audience, and one is from Stuart, who's interested in how we bring unions with us as partners for change rather than resistors. And I know many UK colleagues are experiencing stress around union activity during transformation projects. Maybe Paula first?
Yeah. Look, I think this one is really hard at the moment. Again, being cautious, but unions will have national positions as well as local positions, and I think quite often the work we're having to do locally in the UK context is going to be at odds with those national positions. It really is the obvious stuff. It's meeting with people as often as possible, being really clear about what you can and can't change and the parameters you have to work within. So I think we've spent a lot of time setting the financial context. I think we've spent a lot of time making sure that the data we present is right. So, that really resonated for me. And particularly sharing where you can share and what you can share with the unions is important. So certainly at the moment, I meet union colleagues at least once a week. They're not always easy conversations. I think some tension is right. Some tension is right. That's the role of the union to hold us to account as well. But it's just conversation, trying to find mutual ground. And the mutual ground for me is around staff wellbeing, and supporting staff as best you can, whatever the outcome for that individual might be.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Paula.
we have a very similar experience in the United States, agree very much with everything that Paula said. The one add that I would have is really around building those labor management relationships all along, not just waiting for those big organizational changes and then all of a sudden you're expecting, the union to come along when you haven't really had a robust strategy to communicate with them or be transparent with them before. So really maintaining those relationships throughout, not just during the big transformational changes, is really important.
That's great. Thanks, Susan. So the final question, I think we're only going to be able to bring in one panel member, maybe Jennifer, on this one, is how will AI change operating models in the future? Inevitably be a big question to end us on, and we might have to continue that one after.
What do we? It's like the number one question that everybody has,
Maybe it's a
and we're
follow-on
going to
webinar.
solve it. Here we are solving it together in 2 minutes time. Obviously we could talk all day about AI, right? It's transformational. It is top of mind for everybody. And I think the most important thing of it is, how are you leveraging it in the right way for your institution? Do you have technology enablement already? But I think the biggest piece is, and I don't want to drive it back to organizational design, et cetera, but you can use the best technology. You can use AI, you can use all of these things. But if you don't have the right people and processes in place initially, then AI can't fix those problems, right? And so I've had many institutions who say, I'll give you an example in HR, human resources, right? Let's not have this function, right? Let's just replace it with AI. We can replace this. I said, oh, I don't think that you can. You don't even have simple processes, and you think that your people are going to be okay with that. That's not realistic. So it can't be, again, it's not I'll use the word again, it's not a plaster to put on. It's actually ensuring that you have the right structure, that AI can then enable that and really optimize your processes, your procedures, and all of those things that can make people's lives easier. So are there back-end things that can be enabled with AI? Absolutely. And are there processes, are there things that can be enabled? Absolutely. But really making sure that you have some of those front end things optimized first, so that AI is a tool, it's not a replacement. And Paul, I don't know, you're shaking your head. Maybe you have some thoughts around this too.
Yeah, no,
but we're closing out.
Process.
Yeah.
It's still, but it's so important. You cannot systemize bad processes, and AI cannot work on process environments that are not already fit for purpose.
Terrific. So we're all still needed despite AI. That's good news to end on. I'm going to close this off on time, and I'm very grateful to the panels, particularly colleagues joining early in the morning from the US. I hope the audience has found the discussions useful and helpful. We're certainly living through extraordinary times in higher ed in the UK, US, and globally, and the more we can share and support one another, the better. If you'd like to continue discussions with us as a team and explore how we can support you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you to Paula for joining us for this. We do appreciate your insight and experience. And as I mentioned at the start, we've recorded this session and we'll be sharing it, so you can pass it on to any colleagues you would like to, or watch it again. And if you've got questions you wanted to ask but didn't have a chance to, please contact me and I will bring you answers from our team. We're going to be producing future webinars, so if you've got ideas that you'd like us to explore, let us know.